Hello, statistics students. Here's another video on section 10.3, the chi-square test for associations between categorical variables. There are two tests to determine whether two categorical variables are associated. Which test you use depends on how the data were collected. We often summarize two categorical variables in a two-way table, in part because it helps us see whether associations exist between these variables. When we examine a two-way table, or any data summary for that matter, one aspect that gets hidden is the method used to collect the data. We can collect data that might appear in a two-way table in either of two ways. The first method is to collect two or more distinct independent samples from each population. Each object sampled has a categorical value that we record. For example, we could collect a random sample of men and a distinct random sample of women. We could then ask them to what extent they agree with the statement that same-sex marriage should be allowed, and the responses are strongly agree, neutral, disagree, or strongly disagree. We now have one categorical response variable, opinion. We also have another categorical variable, gender, that keeps track of which population the response belongs to. Hence, we have two samples, one categorical response variable, and one categorical grouping variable. The second method is to collect just one sample. For the objects in the sample, we record two categorical response variables. For example, we might collect a large sample of people and record their marital status, single, married, divorced, or widowed, and their education level, high school, college, graduate school. From this one sample, we get two categorical variables, marital status and educational level. In both data collection methods, we're interested in knowing whether the two categorical variables are related or unrelated. However, because the data collection methods are different, the ways in which we test the relationship between variables differs also. Well, that's the bad news. The good news is that this difference is all behind the scenes. The result of careful calculation shows that no matter which method we use to collect data, we can use the same chi-square statistic and the same chi-square distribution to test the relation between the variables. These two methods have different names. If we test the association based on two samples between the grouping variable and the categorical response variable, which was the first method, the two samples, the test is called a test of homogeneity. If we base the test on one sample, which was the second method, the test is called the test of independence. Two different data collection methods, two different names, but fortunately the same test. The consider data phase of the data cycle is important for correctly identifying the hypothesis test. It's also important, of course, for verifying that the conditions of the test are satisfied. So key point, there are two tests to determine whether two categorical variables are associated. For two or more samples and one categorical response variable, we use a test of homogeneity. For one sample and two categorical response variables, we use a test of independence. So I've summarized it this way. Test of homogeneity is used when using two or more samples and only one categorical response variable. Test of independence used when using one sample and two categorical response variables. In the subsequent videos, I'll cover two examples on how to distinguish between these two. And then following those two examples, we'll look at examples of how to do these two tests. And this concludes this introduction video on the chi-square test for associations between categorical variables.